So now we are recording. And the other piece of logistics is that if you have a question, my recommendation is that you just go ahead and go to the chat. And you can either send a chat to everyone or send it to me directly, and I will try to manage the questions and let Max proceed. So I am greatly excited, and I feel very privileged that our first presenter this year tonight is Max Rudolph, who is a credentialed actuary. He's a fellow of the Society of Actuary. He has also a number of other credentials, including CFA charter holder, this is Chartered Financial Analyst Institute. He's a chartered enterprise risk analyst, and he's a member of the American Academy of Actuaries. And Max, I've known Max for, I don't know how long, but a long time. But Max is and actuaries who are involved with the SOA and various things like the investment symposium and the ERM symposium and those sorts of things. Everybody knows Max because he's so active and he's involved in so many things. So it's hard to even measure the impact that Max has had on the organization as a volunteer and as an expert. Max also runs a number of very important surveys on enterprise risk management within the organization. And in the past, he's been a board member, and he also received a presidential award for his role in developing the CERA credential. One other anecdote I will share about Max is just a more personal one. Having been involved in enterprise risk management myself and my previous employer for the last 20 years, I know that Max has been an active talking about pandemics for about as long as I've known Max, and probably one of the first actuaries that I know of in the ERM space, who started saying, "Hey, you know what? Insurance industry needs to be prepared for a pandemic." So it's all very quite topical, and we're very lucky to have Max come and speak tonight. Now that something he's been talking about for I don't know at least a decade, right, Max?
Yeah, ever since SARS.
Yeah. So that was what, 2003-ish?
Yeah, roughly. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So my memory's not wrong on that. You've been talking about it as long as I've known you. So,
Yep.
So without further ado, I'm just gonna let Max take it away.
So logistically, though, we'll go for an hour total. Is that right? And
Yeah.
so what I'll try to do is talk for about 40 minutes, and then that'll leave plenty of time for questions. So that's maybe teeing up the thought that if you have some questions, I'll do my best to answer them. I'm also pretty honest about if I don't know the answer, I'm happy to say that. So really appreciate the warm introduction. And as Professor Atfield says, we do go back a long ways. Have worked on a number of different projects together over the years. The other things I would say to the listeners, I'm not a doctor. I haven't done any of the studies that are presented here. What I'm trying to do is be like a mosaic investor. I go out and I notice things that are out there, and I have probably a longer time horizon than most people. And so I tend to pick up on here's something new that I'm seeing, and here's how it'll interact with something I already know. And so here's what matters, here's what doesn't matters. And I'm trying to put out some anecdotal things here tonight that are not necessarily, I would guess that historically probably 80 to 90% of the things that I pick up on anecdotally do turn out to be proven later. But I will give you that warning up front that there are some things out there that, I'll mention things like, oh, new symptom, rash, and they may come back later and say, oh, that's not COVID, that's such and such, that's a little bit different. So,
one thing, Max, I'll just interrupt you real quick.
Yep.
Because I'm looking here, and it looks like we have about 17 participants. So I'm going to go ahead and trust that the participants, if you have a question, just go ahead and speak up. Unmute yourself and just say, I have a question, because I think we can handle that under this format.
Sure. Okay. And I also want to thank some of the people who put together some of the charts that I'm using. The Society of Actuaries puts out a regular recurring report that they update their statistics all the time. Their most recent one is August 25th, I believe. And I put the link here if you're interested in going out and looking at that, or any of the supplementary reports that they've done, some of which I've been involved with, some of which most of which I haven't. And Lisa Schilling in particular, she updated a bunch of the graphs for me earlier this week. Now, close to your home, CIDRAP with Dr. Michael Osterholm, he is a Minnesota professor. He does a podcast that I listen to religiously. I had the honor of moderating a session that he spoke at, a keynote for the Actuarial Research Conference here last month. But if you're anywhere involved with Minnesota, hopefully you already are familiar with CIDRAP. And if you're interested in this topic, Dr. Osterholm is one of the key people to follow up with and be aware of. Jim Toole, I'm going to mention some things that he did 10 years ago in a research project, so I always thank him. And the data, even the data that the Society of Actuaries puts together, most of it comes either from the CDC or from Johns Hopkins University that have a really good database. And the one that I'm not using it today, but the one that I like to use is the Washington Post. And as always, keep in mind, this is not investment advice. As a CFA charter holder, I'm kind of obligated to say that. So to kick it off, thought we'd start off with kind of some case results that are kind of interesting. I saw this last week and thought it would be interesting to share with you, where we go back all the way to March, where it kicks off real strong. You see how the US, went up and then came back down into early June, and then the cases shot up again through the 1st of August, and then it, mostly been coming down since then. And then just recently, as schools opened, I think was the primary driver of the U.S. uptick, and hopefully that's already starting to come back down. I'm a little bit more worried on a relative basis to Europe, and I'll show some stuff from the UK here in a little bit, that they are having the surge, and their death counts are starting to kick up as well. Canada, I didn't realize that they were starting to come back up a little bit. I haven't seen the news media kind of pick up on that. And then Japan continues to just have really good results. So a couple of charts that I wanted to share with you. These are based off Johns Hopkins data. What they found early on was that a lot of the data sources didn't report on Saturdays or Sundays, and so the 7-day moving average result is much more useful to look at, much smoother. And so this data is shown daily, but they always also have the total with the 7-day moving average. But here you can see where Europe in particular had the early cases where, down here back in April and May, they were really surging. And then you saw the US and Brazil, and then now the US as you get into July and August. South America with Brazil primarily, and with some of the other countries down there. By the time you get up here, because it's not the 7-day average, it makes it a little bit hard to look at, but you can kind of get the feel. And Oceania, that's where New Zealand, Australia, countries like that. New Zealand obviously has very few cases at this point. It's where you almost don't even see that on this chart, which is great for them. And we should all be studying what they're doing and what Japan's doing in places like that. So the cases also by continent, same thing. One thing I would have you think about is that as we've gone through, you get the deaths and then divided by the cases. So if that number was consistent and stable across time, the shape of these charts would look the same. But you see that it's not. We've got a lot more cases now, and the deaths are actually lower than they were in April and May. And there's a number of things that could be. It could be that it's mutating to a less deadly disease. I think in particular, it's the way that what we learned from those first couple months of treating this disease, to where once you're in the hospital, they quickly figured out that if you roll the patient over, maybe you're less likely to need a ventilator. If you give them a steroid treatment, you're much less likely to die. And I think that's the cause. So I think, when we look at the US, the US was going at 2,000 deaths per day for a while. Now it's down to 1,000 deaths per day. I don't think that means that the virus is any less lethal. I think it just means that the doctors are treating it much better and much more successfully. So the next couple of curves are something that I've been working on. And I want to bring it up from another perspective too, in that the SOA currently has a data visualization call for essays out there. They've extended it at least once and probably going to extend it again. But it doesn't have to be something fancy. I mean, I submitted this chart for that contest. I mean, there's a small prize. It's when we set it up, it was much more set up to try to get college students to participate. And the total prize money is like $1,000, which to you guys might make a difference of, do you want to spend an hour putting something together for the chance to earn a part of $1,000? But in any case, what I'm going to share with you is this chart that Jim Toole put into a report that he did. He did a research report 10 years ago, and I was on the oversight group. So I worked with Jim on this. And what he did was he came up with different shapes based on different pandemics in the past. And so everything is compared against this flat extra. So when we're talking about the CDC moderate scenario, that's a scenario that was built in 2005 under the Bush administration. We've seen a lot in the last 6 months where they talked about how President Bush read the John Barry book, The Great Influenza, and immediately said, hey, this is something that could be a big deal. Let's put a team together to put a plan together. And they put out a report fairly quickly, actually, in November of 2005. But what this shows is that in the moderate scenario, it's 0.07% excess deaths. Okay, so and that would be about what we've got now. We're almost to that today. We're at like 0.05% deaths as a percent of population. And one of the things that I learned as I was updating this here in the last few months was that you've got several moving parts to this. You've got US population, which has grown from about 300 million to about 330 million, so up about 10% over that period. And then we've aged. If you look at the age distribution, we're much older now. It really jumps out at you. And there's also a paper that I've submitted that'll get released publicly here, hopefully before too long, that shows that as well. And so you've got an older population, bigger population. So in 2005, this moderate scenario would be equivalent to a little over 200,000 deaths, where today it's probably more equivalent to 225,000 deaths, which, we just went over 200,000 deaths in the US. So it's a reasonable proxy to look at, okay, here's what could have happened versus what is happening this time. So the flat extra is just the 0.07%. And it's tied to 100% here on the y-axis. So then we compare against that. And if you look at these other curves, you get the U curve, which is this kind of this burnt orange. What you see is you see higher mortality at the very young. Okay, that's seasonal mortality traditionally, or also the pandemics, smaller pandemics in 57 and 68. Also showed this same shape. Now, if you have this shape for your excess deaths, you probably can use a multiplier on your mortality to get the total mortality. But on these other curves, having an additive excess mortality is much more appropriate, because the shape isn't similar to the seasonal curve. So the second one that I want to talk about is this purple one here that comes up in the ages 20s and 30s and then comes back down and then stays down. And that's actually what we saw in 1918. We actually had slightly negative excess mortality at the real high ages, which is really kind of surprising. because we generally think of the very young and the very old as being most susceptible to influenza. But in that case, we don't know if they had some exposure to a similar disease. There was a pandemic in 1890 that's called the Russian flu, that there's some talk that if you were alive at that time, and also in 1918, that you maybe had less of an impact. So that's the odd one. And from an insurance standpoint, that's an important one because all your group life policies would get impacted a lot more. Under normal seasonal mortality, you don't really have a lot of deaths at the working ages. I'll come back to the current coronavirus in a minute. So the hypothetical W curve is essentially saying, okay, what if we use the 1918 curve, but then we also added a spike at the older ages? So we didn't have that protection from some earlier virus, some earlier pandemic. Each one of these curves has the same area beneath it. So they are equivalent. They all come back to this 0.07% across the population. So this J curve is what I've added, and it's an approximation of the COVID-19 experience. Now, COVID-19 is a coronavirus. It's not an influenza, but it's still a pandemic, and it's what we've got to work with. Whoops, didn't mean to go up to there. And so there, we're not seeing any spike at the age 0 or 0 to 5. In fact, you can assume that there's no deaths all the way out until age 50 and not be wrong. And so there, we're still getting the same total number of deaths under this curve, but it really shows how weighted it is towards 85 plus. So then let me go to the next one. And here I'm just comparing that same curve. This blue curve is the same one that I just showed, the J curve, and comparing it to the seasonal U-shaped curve. And then what I did was I dropped in actual experience to date. That's the green curve. And then I ratioed that up so that the area underneath that curve would be the same as the others. So it gives you an idea of what the shape is of the excess mortality. And you see it's almost all at age 85 plus at this point. So on this slide, we're looking across different countries, and I didn't update this. Last time I updated it was at the end of May. I think the shape of these curves, the point I'm trying to make is that it's at older ages across all countries. It's not like France is having an impact at birth and nobody else is. It's pretty consistent. There's some places where because of when the virus came in, that it maybe was lagging a little bit. So you might, and Germany has had some good results in terms of the way that they've treated the cases. Their hospitals actually had excess capacity. One of the things that the U.S. and other countries should be looking at is we're so focused on efficiency with our hospitals that we didn't have that excess capacity. So then we had, then that interacted with the whole, well, should you lock down to flatten the curve? Well, if your capacity is at a higher level, then you don't need to lock down quite as much, and then you can put in different tracing, testing, and other things that some countries have done. The U.S. has not done a good job with that either. So the deaths by race is something that's very interesting, and you're seeing a lot of scientists as well as media, and the SOA is trying to see if they have any data that would help try to figure out what's happening here. What this is showing, the top chart shows the deaths, and so all these bars would add up to 100. And so it's just deaths, as white people had 52% of the total deaths. Well, white people are 60% of the population. So you can look at that and say, okay, white people aren't dying as quickly as the population would expect. Each one of these has a story to tell. The the black is the bad story. It's essentially 69% higher than if everything was equal. And there's a lot of people trying to figure out why, whether there's something genetic in there or whether it's all socioeconomic. And there's probably a combination of both, but the genetic one is harder to get to. And it's interesting, I've been reading some more information back to the 1918 pandemic recently, and they're actually being able to go back and come up with one of the variables they're trying to look at is air quality. And one of the variables that they're using to measure that as a proxy is the coal-fired generation capacity that's in that area, that's nearby that, in that zip code or in that county. I'm not sure exactly how they're doing it, but they're actually trying to go back and do something so that they can compare 1918 to 2020. So that's kind of interesting. One of the things that's surprising to me on here is the Latino population. It's not that much different. I've seen other studies that would have made me expect that number would be maybe a little bit higher as a percentage of the total. And that gets into the whole socioeconomic side of things too. Asian population does a little bit better. The group that really, even worse than the black population that gets hit the worst, is American Indian, Alaska Native, and I'd also throw in Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders, because I've looked at some data on California is doing some data collection for their population, and that's one of the splits that they break out. And it's, the people that are from that population. And the same thing happened in 1918, that American Samoa is one that they show that one part of American Samoa, and I can't remember the names of the two, whether it's North and South or something different, but let's say that's what it is, and say the South quarantined and didn't allow the sailors who were sick into the port. They had no cases at all, but the North, say, that allowed people in, they were just devastated. And it reminds me a lot of the American Indian population when smallpox was introduced with the European settlers, and the impact that had on that population. So that's something to be aware of. So that's probably one that's going to get a lot of attention over the next few months. This is probably one of my favorite graphs that the SOA has put together. It takes recent flu deaths by week, and that's the way that the CDC looks at flu, is they'll show it by week and try to show it so that you can look at differences. There's some other charts that I'll show where we'll look at the last 5 years average in a similar way. And those are both good ways to look at it. But here, there was a story for each of these different flu seasons. You can see the 14 and 15 and even 17 and 18 came early. And those were ones that they were worried about. But you can see that the total, whoops, too far there, that the total maximum for these earlier flu pandemics, or really epidemics just within the US, really didn't get past probably 7,000 or 7,500 in any given week. And those were a big deal because of the lack of additional capacity. Where we get into the COVID deaths here this last year, and they were up over 20,000 for several weeks in a row. Now that was when New York City was being impacted so heavily. And then it has tailed off quite a bit since then, and then came back and spiked as we showed in July and August. Now these most recent weeks, this is data that gets changed week by week as the data improves. And so probably the last 5 weeks, those numbers, I wouldn't view them as saying that it's going back towards zero. It just hasn't been updated yet. So I would say, once you get to probably about here, to week 47, I probably wouldn't assume anything below that right now. So those are interesting numbers. These are the numbers from the UK. And Stuart McDonald is the actuary over there. He puts this out on Twitter. He works at Lloyd's, but his Twitter handle is at Actuary by Day. If you're interested in following him, he's a really interesting follow. And their Office of National Statistics, the ONS, puts out data every 2 weeks, I think, and he and a group of other actuaries go in and right away and update their stuff and get it out right away. And it's interesting because if you look at the British experience, you can see that the 2020 deaths, the blue bars, were lower up until the pandemic started. So we're actually looking to have a good year of lower deaths relative to the 5-year average prior to that. Well, then you get into the end of March and into April, and you see a lot of deaths. And this analysis is a way of looking at excess deaths and COVID deaths in particular. Influenza would be the same thing, where there's questions sometimes about what's written on the death certificate, especially when doctors are being swamped, where they've got a lot of things to keep track of. Filling out the death certificate isn't the number one thing on their list, and that's okay. We want them taking care of our family members and getting that done first. But this is a way of looking and saying, okay, this is just how many people died in that week. So clearly something happened starting the week of once you get into April. And so you can kind of work back that way. Now, the other thing that was interesting that the British were all aflutter over in the last couple of weeks is these bars towards the end on the far right. There's where you had the deaths going back down again, and there was the 1 year, and they came out and said it right away. They said, well, that's an oddball year because there's a bank holiday that isn't always in the same week from year to year. And so it just happens to be here. And so you're not going to get reporting on that day. And so it'll probably catch up the next week. And that's exactly what happened. And they're actually surging again now too, and going into more of a lockdown phase. I come at it from a life insurance standpoint originally. So that's where I start with, but a lot of my thoughts generally I think apply to a lot of financial companies in general. And then just general comments. So, as an actuary or any type of a financial analyst, I think that one of the messages that we get from this is that, this is a discontinuity. And whenever you have a discontinuity, you need to review your rules of thumb. My PE ratio is always 10 for this sector. Well, maybe it's not right now. Maybe it's something different, and you're better off to go back to first principles and try to figure that out and see what makes sense, and try to make sure in your own mind as to why it makes sense. And then one of the ones I've been struggling with a lot lately, until initially the asset side, the assets tanked big time, but then had a V-shaped recovery when the Fed and other stimulus programs kicked in. Should we be, as risk managers, how much should we worry about whether the Fed is acting as the lender of last resort? Should we be putting out reports that say, okay, here's what it is with the Fed mitigating this risk. As long as that works, here's what we think will happen. And then having another report or some additional comments that talk about, well, what if what the Fed's doing, what if they've run out of bullets? What would happen at that point? And the example that I always use is these BBB minus assets, the ones just barely above junk. A lot of companies, financial companies, insurers, private equity guys, banks, they like to use BBB, and sometimes it's an arbitrage against the capital requirements. There's not as much difference between a BBB minus and a BB plus as the capital requirement would tell you. And so there's an advantage to them to working with the rating agency to get as close to that line as they can get. Well, when this hit.
So Max, this is Gary. Can I ask
yeah,
a question?
Certainly.
So could you give a little bit of a description for those that aren't familiar with what triple B means versus double B and why it's important
Okay.
to insurance companies?
Okay. Yeah, the rating agencies, and I'm mainly thinking Moody's and Standard and Poor's here. They have a rating class system that starts with triple A, and then goes to double A and single A, triple B, double B, and within that you have investment grade assets, which are triple B and above. And then once you get to double B, you get non-investment grade, or what is commonly referred to as junk bonds. So those are companies that are much more likely to default. A AAA bond is more like very close to a treasury, very close to a government issue bond, very low risk, at least from a credit perspective. And that rating goes down as the default probability goes up. Does that hit what you were looking for,
Yep,
Gary? Or
yep, yep.
okay. Um, and so that's one where the Fed initially wasn't going to protect assets below investment grade, and then they were lobbied for about a week before they announced it. But they came back and said, well, if something falls from investment grade to non-investment grade, well, we'll backdrop that. We'll support that as well. And that helped insurers quite a bit, because there were a number of insurers who had really bet big on those triple B assets. But I don't think it was the insurers that got it done. I think it was the private equity guys, that they were doing the same thing with a lot of their leveraged buyouts. They were setting them up as triple Bs and worried about it falling. So there's all kinds of anything that people have been doing to reach for yield is probably at risk today. And that's probably a 3 or 4 hour talk that Professor Atfield would be just as good at talking about it, and in certain ways better than I would be. So if you look at from a typical actuary, where we work, if you're a life insurer, you're probably pandemic is going to hit your assets. Now they're going to hit your mortality, but for an insurance company anymore, for life insurance company, the life products are such a small percentage anymore. We're much more of assets under management, the AUM, that drives the business. And so the spread on that business is bringing in, probably 10 times as much profit as the mortality part from the life insurance. And on this type of, you remember, we looked at the J curve there, where almost all of the deaths are at real old ages, where you already have reserves built up. You pay a premium that's higher than you really need at the early ages, and then you build up a reserve because of that. And so your net amount at risk, the amount that actually comes out of your profits, if you have excess mortality, is much smaller at the older ages than it would be, if it was the group life policy, at age 30 or age 40 that was dying. So I focused here on the asset side with the defaults, and we use nominal interest rate guarantees. The Fed has already said they're not going to raise rates for at least 3 or 4 years. That's an issue for life insurers and for the NAIC, the regulator of the life insurance companies in the U.S. We probably need to take a step back and think about that in terms of real rates as opposed to nominal rates. But so those are the primary risks as I see them for life insurers. For health insurers, it's a little bit more direct, because certainly there are costs to going in the hospital. But there's also the offset of all the deferred care. And what they're finding is that the deferred care is actually bigger than the extra costs from actually treating people with COVID-19. And I actually just saw something earlier this week that said that they were starting to see critical illness claims that were low. And that one scares me a little bit, because that's a product that it pays out if you are diagnosed with cancer or some other specific disease. And what that tells me is that people are deferring the checkups that would identify, somebody who has cancer. And if you wait another year, and the cancer is still building inside you before you get diagnosed, that's not a good sign. So if you've deferred care for any reason, this is the time now to go back in and at least get some of those basic checkups done. And then we're just now starting to see some results on the disability and long-term care side. I know on the property casualty side, they're worried from a workers' comp standpoint, where if you got a healthcare worker that dies of COVID-19 because they caught it on the job, the cost for that, people were locked down and staying at home, so not driving. So most of the auto companies gave refunds or credits against future premiums. And then for the P&C companies, this business interruption product is probably the big one so far. It's essentially written into the contract that says, and they wrote it into the contract after SARS when they recognized that they were at risk for this, but they specifically excluded pandemics from their, if you're like if you have a flood or something and your business has to close down, that's what this product is designed for. And you can buy a product that also includes pandemics. The Wimbledon tennis tournament did that this year, and they've done it for 20 years. But it paid out this year. They paid out, I want to say they paid out like $50 million. It was in the tens of millions of dollars. But how many policyholders actually know that it doesn't cover pandemics? That's the question. And so there's a lot of court cases going on right now about that. And then pension plans are a lot of the asset issues. And on top of that, the initial underfunding of their defined benefit plans. I'm going to need to probably move a little bit quicker because we're not going to get through, but that's okay. Here on the evolving practices, there's some things that are changing. I'm going to focus here just on the healthcare one, maybe. Telemedicine, a lot of things are working there, including mental health. They're actually finding that, surprisingly, that they're able to help people over Zoom, without having to actually bring the person into the office. Supply chain, the big issue there is that a lot of the drugs that we take, the pharmaceutical drugs, are made in either China or India. And that's an issue, trying to figure out with trade wars and everything else going on, how to work through that. I wanted to point this one out. It's just a list of where infection was detected, and it's specific to Israel. Most places don't have a good feel for this. The one that jumps out at me is this educational institutions, because the other choices that they have and the percentages don't really surprise me, but I'm not sure if they're doing something different that they should be, improving on. I don't know if that's colleges and universities or if that's K through 12. I assume it's K through 12. But the good results that the U.S. has seen as schools have reopened at the K through 12 level makes me think that they're doing something different. So this is just a list of clusters of symptoms, and it's one that I pulled from somebody else, but then I've adjusted it. And then I've highlighted some of the ones that are intriguing to me. These are respiratory diseases, and yet you've got diarrhea as one of the symptoms potentially for gastrointestinal when it starts getting bad. Some of the early symptoms have been loss of smell. Some of the people who thought they were asymptomatic actually had a loss of smell. Some of the cognitive things kind of scare me, especially if those are longer lasting. And then long haulers is one that you're seeing a lot of people talk about the last couple weeks. It's one that I think is going to become a bigger deal. And there's similarities to 100 years ago, where you had some of these symptoms that lasted much like a sleeping sickness, a chronic fatigue syndrome type of a thing, where people are just so tired, and it's based on inflammation inside the body. And I found some symptoms, that were from 1918, where they were talking about earaches and sinus infections. And then now there was a story just this week talking about some people who thought they were asymptomatic or maybe had minimal symptoms, but now 3 or 4 months later, all of a sudden their hair's falling out. So there's a whole range of symptoms that don't assume that if you have a symptom that it's not this until you get tested. And there's also this multisystem inflammatory syndrome, which I think is pretty similar to COVID and maybe is COVID. But that's where you're getting these COVID toes, where you get a rash on your toes or fingers because the blood isn't getting enough oxygen, and those are the extremities, and so that's where it's paying the price first. And there's actually some stories of people who were having surgery on blood thinner, and the blood was actually clotting right during the surgery. So there's some issues with that. A lot of heart issues, and I think that's something to watch going forward. You know, I mentioned the missed screenings, having more drugs and suicide, unfortunately. And then one of the issues is people are getting sick, having heart attacks at home, and they're afraid to go to the hospital. So they end up dying at home, partly because they're self-isolating, and so there's not able to call, and partly they just don't want to call because they don't want to go to the hospital. So a lot of strokes. This R sub T, the last bullet on here, I wanted to point out too. That's really the key. We want to get that below 1. That's where you're talking about how many people does each case infect. And if you're going to stay steady going forward with the number of cases, then that number is going to be exactly 1. If it's greater than 1, then the cases will grow over time. If it's below 1, cases will decline and eventually go to 0. A recent study that I saw actually showed that people, even by just wearing like your regular glasses, that was protective. So it's a real strong sign for masks and you know, some of the other hand washing and social distancing issues. Interesting study on younger people. Now the young are less likely to get in the hospital, but once you get in the hospital, the numbers are pretty much the same as from a percentage standpoint as if you were older. And it's the same comorbidities: hypertension, diabetes, BMI index with obesity. Men are more likely, and this study showed Black and Hispanic were more likely to have a poor outcome. We want to switch all these things from lagging indicators, things like deaths and cases, to leading indicators, things that we can try to anticipate what's happening ahead of time. So, you know, that's why you're seeing more and more, they're trying to show hospitalizations. They're trying to calculate the number of tests that are taken, the number of doctor visits, and even you're seeing a lot of Google searches for, you know, how can I take a test, or Google search for COVID-19 symptoms, things like that, and that's been pretty good. There's one that they're doing that's they're testing sewage, and actually finding that your sewage has, even while you're asymptomatic, your sewage is not. So they're able to kind of anticipate and maybe locally lock down places a little bit quicker. A lot of the universities with research staff are doing that. This is a list of things. I assume that these slides will be available afterwards to anybody who wants to see them. So these are just some things to look for after the fact. You know, we get into some of the things that were probably going to happen anyhow, but they've been accelerated. You know, this whole automation, and my example would be the UVC, you know, like the lightsabers that they're showing that provide, they kill the virus. And so they're using them in hospital rooms. They're using them in ventilation shafts, so that as your air circulates, that it cleans out the virus as it goes past it. So that's a thing that we're seeing move forward. You're seeing less and less cash. You know, anybody with kids knows that the ball pits at McDonald's are disgusting. Those are probably going to be moving out. Buffets, unfortunately for many of us, those are going to be moving out. Even shaking hands, will that come back after the fact? The one that I think is going to come back in is the multi-generational homes. You know, right now, how many how many people that are 40 to 60 are taking care of both the parent and their child is living with them. We're already moving in that direction. This is just going to speed that up. And then some financial things that I think we should be thinking about that would help. Some of these auto stabilizers, things like unemployment insurance that help to stabilize the consumer spending. In Europe, they do a much better job with that, with this furlough system. And I think in the US, at least, we need to do more research of what other countries did or had set up ahead of time so that we can, steal the best ideas. The supply chains, as I mentioned, a lot of the drugs are made overseas. We need to domesticate some of that, take away some of the efficiency and build in some resilience and redundancy. In infrastructure, a lot of countries, Canada, and I think some of the European countries have essentially said that, we'll give you money, but you have to spend it on green projects. So we want to end up in a better place than we were before. And I mentioned the UVC lights, they're really expensive right now, but if you can use it on PPE so that they don't have to throw away after one use, it can be cost effective for those places. And then as they make more of them, all of a sudden we'll be able to put them in our homes. That wraps it up for me. I do want to point out my website has a section that talks about pandemics and has some of those papers that I wrote back in 2005 to 2010. And it's fascinating to me to go back and read them now to see how little has changed, how much you could have printed some of these things a week before, in February, and it still would have been just as appropriate, because a lot of the things we were talking about was, hey, watch out for the supply chain. The assets are going to be a bigger deal on the life insurance side, and just the things that we were picking up coming out of the SARS. I should maybe wrap up with the reason I originally got interested in pandemic research was coming out of SARS. I watched what was happening in Canada and in China, Hong Kong, and thought, this is something that life insurers should be pricing for. And we weren't, because our data was using just the most recent, 20 years, let's say, of mortality data. So it didn't go back to 1919. And so I thought, well, if I put it into my company's mortality charge, I'm not ever going to sell another product. So what I need to do is to make it an industry issue and get it on the radar of the NEIC, and eventually, and I wasn't directly involved with that, but I was part of the group that helped to make that happen, to where, then there was a capital charge to where then everybody had to do the same thing, and then it got into the pricing. So it had what I thought was a reasonable result. So with that, I'd love to take any questions that anybody has.
I'm hoping some of the students or some of the other people that are in the audience will free to chime in with a question. I do have a question. So Max, you've done a lot of thinking about this, and I'm sure that in your mind, there are any number of plausible scenarios for what is going to play out. So I guess I was going to ask sort of a two-part question. And the first part is, what's the scenario that you would consider the most likely scenario, what you might call the mode scenario? Not that that's what's going to happen, but there's always a mode scenario, right? And then the follow-up question is, what's the scenario that keeps you up at night? That's obviously not going to play out so well.
Well, it's hard to get into scenarios without getting political. I'm actually peer reviewing a scenario set that a futurist is putting together for one of the major international nonprofits. And then I actually had a discussion with him this morning, and this is the exact topic we talked about, because he's putting together these scenarios and he's avoiding the election. he's trying to put together scenarios that, are independent of who wins the U.S. election, but they're U.S. scenarios. And I think, my personal opinion, and trying not to be overly political, but the current administration hasn't done a very good job. I can't imagine that it would get any worse under a different administration. So my worst case scenario is that the Republicans sweep everything and, essentially cut off all the stimulus programs, and essentially keep the money, and essentially don't care about the population anymore. That's my worst case scenario. And it's pretty bad. I think I have a other scenario, and I kind of look at this more. I'm not sure I like the modal thing for this. I like deterministic scenarios for this, but it's almost like I could come up with, okay, there's this worst case one that, there's not a whole lot I can do if that one plays out. But if we get someone in there who has ideas of what to do, and just, puts a mask mandate in there, opens things up, has a plan, and to open things back up, that also has statistics in there that say when things should close back down even after it started to open. I think a lot of that could play out fairly well. And I think, what we should be doing is stealing ideas from countries that are at, much lower caseloads and, deaths than the U.S. is right now. And that's where I would split out the deterministic scenarios, is ones where, everybody participates, and then ones where maybe only 50% of the people wear masks. And I would split it out maybe that way. I'm really worried about where we started from a financial standpoint, and this is something that I put into I do a set of financial predictions every year in January. And I've been talking about this for years, but it's even worse now that we don't have any resilience built into the financial system. We've got 130% debt to GDP ratio. It's as high as it's been, except for World War II. And there it went up to that and then came down right away because everyone realized that it shouldn't be that high. Where now it's kind of viewed as, well, this is the minimum. MMT is that's another one that worries me a lot, is, the politicians, I've met Stephanie Kelton. She's kind of the economist who's associated with it. And I think what she would tell you is that, it relies on politicians to set taxes at a level that is sustainable. But I don't think the politicians view it that way. So I think the Republicans have acted as if they were under an MMT scenario where they could just spend as much as they want because they're a reserve currency, ever since 2000. And the Democrats did the same thing, to where we don't have that. We need someone to be an adult in the room. And until we see that, I have a lot of concerns just in general about how this all plays out. Kind of a long-winded answer.
No, that's fine. And I'll give you a pass on any political talk, because as anybody who's in the U.S. right now, and not everybody here is from the U.S., but anyone who's in the U.S. right now knows that everything's political right now. So, yeah. So par for the course.
Unfortunately.
Yeah. Any other questions from our audience?
Hi. Thank you for the talk. Since you talk about the monetary policy, I wonder, I've heard two different thoughts on that. Some people say we're going to face an inflation because the pure money created in the past few months. And someone say we're going to face a deflationary environment because of the production level is so low and people are not spending money. So what's your take on that? Are we going into inflation or deflation from this point?
Well, and I'll answer, and then I'll encourage Professor Hatfield to throw in his 2 cents as well. But the answer is, I would say it is yes. I think personally that we're going to see inflation and potentially, depends on how you define hyperinflation. I think we'll see certainly double-digit inflation in the U.S. And likely 15%. If they can hold it under 20, they'll be doing a really good job. I think personally that the demographics is the driver behind why eventually we'll have a deflationary scenario. But I think you can have the inflation first, and then your deflation is in the long term. And a paper that I wrote last year, co-authored last year on low growth, talks about some of the implications of that. I don't know, Gary, do you want to add something?
So
it's a great question.
It's a terrific question. And I guess that I guess I'll give a couple comments on it. The first question, if I'm asked this question as somebody who may or may not be an expert, probably more on the may not. But it's like somebody who has gotten really, really good at navigating the world, and now they've been teleported to another universe where the laws of physics are now different, and now they're supposed to predict what's going to happen. So, I think, even, post 2009, we talked about sort of the new normal, and all the rules had changed. And now, some changed and some hadn't, but now I think, we're in completely uncharted waters here. And I think Max is kind of trying to look at, well, what sort of economies in history can we look at that this is analogous to, and maybe try to look at economies that may have had hyperinflation, and that sort of thing. So I think, so I'll caveat anything I would say before that. My intuition, which could be completely wrong, is that in the near term, we're going to get away with this in the sense of we're going to continue with the low growth and non-inflation. I anticipate that the current fiscal policy and monetary policy is absolutely not sustainable. It's impossible. So yeah, it's somebody at the door. So this is also COVID and Zoom, right? So so it's not sustainable. It's absolutely not sustainable from a U.S. perspective, but even internationally. But I think especially from a U.S. perspective, both from the perspective of what the Fed's doing and what the federal government is doing on a taxation and spending policy perspective. So it's buckle up, folks, because it's going to be an interesting ride the next few years.
Yeah, and one of the things that I would add would be to talk a little bit about currency wars. I mean, every central bank is trying to reduce the value of their currencies so that they can export more. And you can't have inflation until somebody becomes the adult in the room. And I think my best guess as to who that might be in the long term would be Germany. If the EU breaks apart, and Germany's still so afraid of the 1920s that they're much more likely to balance their budgets and have a strong currency than probably anybody else. And they're a big enough economy to do that. Now, are they truly a big enough economy to become the reserve currency, or would you need to have a basket of currencies? Those, like Gary said, it's we're in a different world. I have lots of thoughts, but I'm sure they're all wrong. It's a great question, and one that, what do you think?
I'm kind of a mix on this, so I'm more inclined into the inflation group. But on the other hand, I have heard lots of people say, in like this time, given the money print and the trickle-down economy is not working because people who has the spending power are not really spending and become more cautious. So it's which is why lots of people talk about we may not hit the whatever inflation target there. But in the meantime, I personally think the CPI basket are so outdated, are not like truly capture what's going on in this economy. So, but instead at the same time, because I work in fixed income, and given the current interest rate environment, I wonder on an ongoing basis, are we going to see the interest rate risk got eliminated for quite a few years, and all what you earn either from insurance perspective or actuarial perspective are more the credit spread for the next 5 to 10 years? Because it's like from 1970s to now, like the volatility of the interest rate has come down a lot. So
yeah, there's so much, there's so much subsidization of companies, and to where the default risk is very low in terms of the way it's measured. So you can't earn any return because, you know, they bail you out every time. You'd be better off if they didn't bail you out and you could take a little risk and show your expertise. What all the stimulus does is essentially moves everybody together, both the people who are capable of dealing with volatility and the people who aren't. It makes everybody think they're smart.
Yeah. So it's like how you become IG, and IG becomes your treasury, treasury becomes your saving account.
Yeah. Well, and I was talking to somebody today about be aware that your money market fund could start charging you to keep your money there. You know, you're getting what, 5 basis points now?
Do you see that as a long-term negative for insurance company, or if you see the curve steepening in a short period of time, then insurance company can be more profitable going forward?
I think it's gonna be tough for all savers, you know, whether it's a pension plan or life or insurance company, or whether it's me as an individual trying to save for my own retirement. It's gonna be really tough to figure out how to make it work. I mean, you almost need to just assume you're gonna earn zero and make sure you save enough. And then if something happens to where you're able to get some returns, then okay, you've got a little gravy. But there's so many people that have not saved anything. You know, especially going into an event like COVID, and you know, what are they going to do? They're going to have to move in with somebody else. You know, you're going to see more. You know, I'm thinking back to some of the old TV shows. You know, and was it Golden Girls? They had all the senior aged women living. You know, 4 of them all living together. You know, Betty White and that group. You know, shows like that are going to be reality, because you won't be able to afford to live in your own place. That could very well be a blip, a generational blip that, you know, is going to change going forward.
All right, thank you. So
yeah,
thank you
question.
for taking time to answer my question.
Yeah. So that's great. We're past the hour, so I'm going to stop the recording now. However.